Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for everyone to gather. Thank you for joining us. We'll start our program in just a second. All righty. Well, let's begin. Thank you for joining us. My name is Peter Johnson. I'm Vice President of Development at National Review Institute. And today we have our quarterly Across the Pond series. And we'll be featuring our British NRI Fellows, John O'Sullivan and Douglas Murray. John joins us from Bucharest and
Budapest.
Budapest, yes, exactly. Budapest, and Douglas is now in the US working on his forthcoming book. We're going to be talking about what's on everyone's mind these days, the fight for Ukraine. There will be plenty of time for Q&A at the end, so please type your questions in the chat box, and in the Q&A portion, I will read those questions off. So please, as those questions come up in your mind, put them in the chat box. And we'll get to them in the second half of the program. Before I introduce our speakers, we've got a couple of housekeeping items. NRI is coming to Dallas, Houston, Chicago, and New York City with our regional seminar series. We have already hosted 2 of these events in California, and they were huge successes. Under the theme of creating opportunity, we have a great lineup of speakers in each city, and we hope you will join us. Miranda will put the RSVP link in the and details in the chat right now. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers for today. I'm sure you're familiar with John O'Sullivan. He's an author and journalist. He's a senior fellow at National Review Institute and is also editor-at-large at National Review, where he served as editor-in-chief. He spent the last 4 decades as a writer, columnist, and editor on news organizations and magazines on both sides of the Atlantic. Douglas Murray is a best-selling author, journalist, and senior fellow at National Review Institute. He has been an associate editor at the Spectator magazine since 2012 and has written regularly there, as well as for other publications, including National Review. His new book, The War in the West, will be available April 26, which you can pre-order now on Amazon or wherever you get your books. All right, Douglas, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. What a pleasure it always is to be with NR readers and NRI members for this quarterly discussion, which I always personally look forward to very much. And I'm particularly looking forward to the discussion today because I haven't had a chance to speak with John O'Sullivan since the war in Ukraine started, and I very much want to hear what he has to say about the situation in the neighborhood, of course, because John's sitting in a country which has a border with Ukraine and where all of these issues have become exceptionally vital in recent weeks. Let me, though, perhaps open by suggesting making a few remarks about where I see things at the moment. Everybody present is, I know, highly informed about the situation and knows what has led up to this, knows the situation, I think, where we are now, and most of us are watching it very closely on a day-to-day basis. But let me just throw out a sort of general overview of something I think is perhaps little remarked upon at the moment, which is that so far, it seems to me that this conflict, this war, has been a war in which almost all of our understandings of even 3 weeks ago have been almost completely inverted. And let me give a minimal list in no particular order of priority. 3 weeks ago, Vladimir Putin was widely regarded as a strong man inside and outside of his country. Today, he looks misinformed, a man of bad judgment, isolated, and much more. 3 weeks ago, President Zelensky of Ukraine looked like a comedian who'd been promoted to a rather surprising job. And now he looks like a strong man and a genuinely strong and brave national leader. Just a few weeks ago, the EU looked extraordinarily, indeed irreconcilably divided Today, it has never looked more united. Just 3 weeks ago, people were still asking the question we'd all asked in the West for 3 decades: whither NATO? What is the point of NATO? Today, the point of NATO has rarely looked clearer, and indeed there are countries now eager to join it more than at any point in many years. To continue the list, I mean, I could go on and on, but overnight, Germany decided to double its defense spending. Countries like Sweden, that had regarded World War II as being a somewhat murky conflict in which it was rather difficult to choose sides, have started to arm the Ukrainian people. And even Switzerland, a country not known for its financial transparency or indeed morality, has decided that it will prevent Russian oligarchs from getting access to their bank accounts in Switzerland. So all sorts of things that we presumed to be the case and the norm, even up till a few weeks ago, have all been completely turned upside down. And first of all, I wanted to start, John, by saying, I wonder if you agree with that proposition, and if so, whether, like me, you rather marvel at the fact that it seems to have happened without any particular one Western leader having led the charge.
Well, I will qualify your very last remark in a minute, Douglas. But yes, I mean, essentially, I agree with all the points you've just raised. Let me just, so to speak, hit the ball over the net by discussing a couple of them. I would say one of the most interesting reversals in our own mind of what we thought before is we're not nearly so much afraid of the Russian armed forces as we were. Now, I'm not despising them, of course. They're actually blowing to bits half of the cities in Ukraine, and they're doing so with a complete lack of concern for civilian casualties and for the future of the country, in a sense, because they're destroying an enormous amount of the wealth that's been built up and the ability of people to live and function and prosper in an economy by the kind of amazing destructiveness which they're wreaking on Ukraine. But they are not doing as well against the Ukrainians as we expected. Now, that's partly of something which I think you and I probably did expect, which is that the Ukrainians would do better than the general opinion. I mean, if you talk to Ukrainians, they knew that they've known for a long time that this was coming. They may not have been able to predict the exact date, and of course it might have been averted, hopefully, but they knew that this was an attack on the way and their very existence as a country. Then, after all, Putin has done one thing, which is very admirable in a way. He's been very clear about his intentions. I mean, he's given several lectures and he's sent several diplomatic notes to the West. Let me again just mention 2. One is his historical essay makes it plain with, in my view, a lot of historical information. I'm not an expert on Russian and Ukrainian history, but he's taken to the cleaners on those issues by several historians, Neil Ferguson, Andrew Roberts in today's Telegraph, in which they point out that Putin's claim to base his policy on the civilizational unity between Ukraine and Russia is based on a lot of historical misconceptions. He, of course, also, at 2 years ago, when there was the anniversary of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, one of the things he did was send out a long and serious essay, one has to give him that, in which he essentially defended the decision of Stalin to sign a pact with Hitler, and although he doesn't stress this aspect of it, to actually supply Hitler with material for war for 2 years, and thus sort of justifying just in that way, helping Hitler at that point. But this is now defended by Putin as a kind of necessary adjustment in preventing the Western powers attacking the Soviet Union and destroying it. Now, the third is, of course, the note that was sent by the Russian government to the Americans and to NATO, in which they essentially demanded that the end of the Cold War in 1889 and 91 be reversed. And that countries like the one I'm in, Hungary at the moment, would have to leave NATO, and there couldn't be any weapons any in the regions close to the Soviet Union of NATO's. Now, obviously, one can reach all kinds of disarmament agreements, and I hope, and ultimately, when this is over, we will. But the idea that the Russians can dictate a complete bouleversement of the NATO position, in effect destroying the American position in NATO, in effect dividing America from Europe and ensuring that the victory of the Cold War, which they themselves celebrated at the time, would be abandoned and reversed. So these are all things which we should really worry about, because they suggest not simply some kind of settlement with a Putin-led Russia once we've settled a few disputes, once we've got people at the table, once we've got better understanding. They suggest a view of Russian policy, an attempt to recreate in today's Russia the greater Russia with a neo-imperial mindset that doesn't regard its neighbors as equal powers in any sense, but looks upon them as constituent parts of a Russian empire, which may be allowed greater or lesser liberty, but which ultimately have to bend to the will of the Kremlin. And that's not something that can be accepted in the modern world. And it's certainly counter to the interests of the United States. So I think that this is a very, very serious matter, and I don't think we can allow ourselves to well, let me put it this way: the Biden administration, it seems to me, has had a completely mistaken approach to this. Its principal activity in the last few weeks has been assuring the Russians the things they won't do. You know, if you go any further in this matter, we will not have any troops in that area. We won't intervene. We will not. It's as if we are afraid of them and want to, give them in a sense, appease the bully before the bully decides to take action against us. That is a completely unrealistic position. It was unrealistic 3 weeks ago before the war, and now that we're seeing the performance of the Russian army, it looks even more unnecessary. We really have got to realize that there are things we have to do to change things. You mentioned some of them, but we should not really be persuaded by Putin's attitude that he's the stronger and we're the weaker power, and we have to bend to his will.
Now, that brings me on to something which I mentioned in passing, which is the EU. Of course, you're in Hungary and bordering Ukraine, and in one of the countries that the EU has, as we've discussed before, and is across the pond seminars, been gunning for effectively. One of the many things that has struck me in recent weeks on a political level is that, of course, the two countries in particular, which the EU has most singled out for criticism, and you might say that parts of the American left and right have also singled out for criticism within the EU, are Hungary and Poland. And Poland in particular now seems to have had a certain transformation internationally. It is now regarded Poland is back as a positive force. People are praising Poland, quite rightly, for its bringing in of how many refugees? 1.5 million, I think, now from Ukraine. An extraordinary humanitarian effort. What are the realities on the ground there in Hungary and in the other neighboring countries in terms of coping with this unbelievable, terrible 20th century-like exodus of people from the Ukraine?
Well, first of all, the Poles are taking in more refugees than any other power. That is perfectly true. But all of the countries, almost all of the countries which are neighbors of Ukraine, are doing the same. Slovakia, for example, it's quite a small country, and yet it's taken in, the other day this was, about 170,000 refugees so far. And since I spoke, many more will have arrived. The Hungarians actually have brought in a great number. I think that the other day it was over 200,000, and I think it will be more now. And I think when we add up, finally, if this goes on for much longer, we're going to find that something like almost 3 million people have left Ukraine for the neighboring countries. And I think by the end of this, it's going to be more like 5 million people. That's the biggest dislocation in recent years of movement caused about by the movement of population. If you want a comparison with those things, it was 1.5 million people came into Europe in the 2015 refugee crisis. If you want to go back to the 1956, I think it was something like 150 to 200,000. The world refugee year settled about 1 million refugees. All of these were who were in displaced people's camp 15 years after the war, and arranged for them to settle in a whole series of countries. Many of those refugee settlements were very well handled, particularly 56, by all of the Western countries, and also World Refugee Year. This, it seems to me, is also being very well handled. There isn't any resistance, and I think this is understandable. People look at these refugees and they say, well, there's no doubt they're genuine refugees. They're not economic migrants. They're not people trying to pull a fast one. Secondly, they're mainly, in fact, women and children. Most of the men are staying home to fight. And that's the exact opposite of the situation in the 2015 crisis, where the great majority of the refugees claiming to be refugees were in fact young men. Also clear that these people don't intend to stay. I mean, they are hoping that the crisis will be settled and they can go home. That's why there's not so much interest in going as far as Britain. The pro-refugee organizations in Britain are kind of attacking the government for not accepting more, but there doesn't seem to be the same demand to go to Britain, because they want to be near where they live as far as they can, well, as long as they're safe. So, so there is this. So by and large, the governments, the EU and the aid organizations, civil society, NGOs, the Order of St. John, the Red Cross, they are all cooperating very well. I think everybody can take credit for this. It's one of the forms of cooperation. I don't think I'm just a bit pessimistic that that's going to be the case indefinitely, because in a sense, migration and refugee policy have been weaponized by the left against the right, and we're seeing that in Britain in the attacks on Boris Johnson. And here's where I come in with my qualification to what you opened with. I think actually Boris has done well. He's had, so to speak, a good war, as the old Tory expression has it, to date. First, because the Brits have actually done more in terms of training and equipping the Ukrainians in the last 5 years. And secondly, because they've done the same thing by committing more troops to the countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, where obviously we need the maximum number of non-local troops to demonstrate to Russia the seriousness of our commitment to their defense. And so he has, and I don't think there's any metric in which Boris has actually done badly. People have argued that he should have taken action earlier to get rid of the oligarchs and seize their fortunes and so on. I think that argument is now dead anyway, because there has been a lot of action against them. But even so, I'm not sure I want a society in which government simply seizes property without anybody having any legal process or defense against it. So for one way and another, Boris has emerged well from this. And I noticed, I was watching a program with Radek Sikorski, the former Polish foreign minister, who tends to be these days more on the left, but he was quite, he knows Boris, and he basically said he thought Boris was doing a good job. he also said that, of course, he regretted that Boris wasn't in the European councils where his arguments could be heard. But he then went on to say one of the advantages Boris has had is that because he's not in those kind of councils, he can make policy. They can be quick and agile and do things in a way that the European Union finds it difficult to do, despite your reasonable praise for it at the beginning.
Yes, the day that Radek Sikorski recognizes the virtues, or some of the virtues, of Brexit is a truly upside down day indeed. Let me just ask a couple of other things about this. Firstly, I completely agree with what you say about Boris. I think Boris Johnson is one of several world leaders who have been saved from political disaster by this far greater actual disaster in the Ukraine. I think also of Justin Trudeau in Canada, who was in an exceptionally tight spot politically, domestically, and who now is able to send out typically preening videos of himself touring various countries, pretending to be a statesman. But that aside, yes, I think Boris Johnson is one of those who has been partially, or at least for the time being, saved by this real threat occurring right on the borders of Europe. But to come back to those things that we thought we knew until a few weeks ago, now it's much less clear, or perhaps even been inverted. One of the ones that strikes me is, and it goes back to what you quite rightly added about the Russian armed forces, are perhaps overestimation of their capabilities. Is there any feeling in Hungary and in the neighborhood at the moment that with the bogging down that had already happened in Ukraine from to the Russian armed forces, that there is any realistic likelihood that however Ukraine goes from here, that Vladimir Putin really is going to be able to, or would desire to, for instance, try to invade any of the Baltic states or any of the other countries that he's perhaps had in his eye until a few weeks ago?
Well, I don't think there is that feeling. Here's what I think the feeling is. First of all, there's a general and generalized anxiety. The people in this part of the world live in countries in which the tanks have rolled through time and again in both directions, in conflicts in which they were not always primarily interested, in which sometimes, as in the 1940s, they tried to stay out of but couldn't. So that's the first point. Secondly, they're made very nervous by if the borders of any state are changed without universal consent. Because once that happens, then the awkward fact then reemerges that, as someone said in about 1914, the problem with Central Europe is that every England has its Ireland and every Ireland has its Ulster. And the scattered population means there are people who would like to see a redrawing of boundaries. And I think practically every responsible politician just doesn't want that kind of thing to come onto the agenda. And they fear that it might if Putin gets away with this. And also if, of course, the economic consequences of this, of the war are so bad that you create discontented people in every country. So that's the second. And then I think you come on to the point you're raising, which is has Putin shot his bolt? Well, we have to admit that he's suffered a series of reverses, but the war isn't over. And although I think that in the north, in the area where the Battle of Kiev seems to be about to begin in a serious way, they certainly have been bogged down there, and they certainly face a terribly difficult task. If you look at the costs of the attacking forces in the Battle of Budapest, for example, the Siege of Budapest took place in 2 months at the end of 1944-45. And in that, the Russians who won, they nonetheless suffered casualties estimated at between 100,000 and 160,000 soldiers. Now that simply could not be, those casualties of that kind of order could not be replaced easily by Putin. And that's why he's going around the world trying to get people like jihadists from Syria and so on to come to his help. So I would say that's going to fortify the sentiment you're suggesting, namely, we don't have to worry about him anymore. But nonetheless, in the south, he looks as though he may succeed in cutting off the Ukraine from the Black Sea. It would be a landlocked country, and that makes it much easier for him to achieve one of his main war aims, which is that Ukraine be a failed state that in no way poses a threat either to Russia in a geopolitical sense or to his regime in a moral and ideological sense, because we shouldn't forget that one of the things he's trying to preserve is the idea that his kind of government is superior to the democratic government that the Ukrainians, with a lot of faults and flaws, I know, have managed to achieve and to be strengthening. In a less easy to describe way, I would say there's a feeling in Ukraine. I'm afraid there's also a feeling tragically here in Belarus among ordinary people that what they want to be is a modern country. They want to be able to go to other countries, to be free, to have a good life. And that is something that Ukraine has achieved to some degree. And that's a threat to Putin. And so I don't think I think you have to say, until the war is over, we can't say that he's lost it, and we can't say that it won't give him some advantages. And the other advantage it will give him is that people will still be afraid of him, because even though we can see that the strategy of the Russian army is the strategy derived from weakness, it is a pulverizing strategy. And anyone who lives in a city like Kiev is going to be horrified by the thought that could it happen here.
Now, there's two major things I wanted to touch on before we go out to our participants. The first is this: having said that we now know things that we didn't know 3 weeks ago and everything has been turned up on its head, I'm going to invite you to do that most dangerous of intellectual exercises and try to look forward. How do you think this conflict ends?
Well, I would say there are three possible endings. The first, a Russian defeat. You should not rule that out completely. They're obviously doing sufficiently badly in the north, in the battle for Kiev, or rather, they look as though they will do badly. And if Putin is deterred from using biological weapons, which obviously the British government fears he may think of using, because it's a way of winning an urban battle without the kind of casualties I was suggesting the Russians might find themselves afflicted with, then I think what we, I'm sorry, I've just been distracted by something on the phone there. Where was I? Oh yeah, Putin has got the first one is a Russian defeat. It could happen if that army in the north is so demoralized and suffers such casualties that it simply melts away in the whole thing, as it did in the end of the First World War. So that's one. That would not give us any problems. I mean, it would give us problems of solving the problems that were littered around, but that would be an unambiguously good thing. The second is that there should be some kind of peace settlement, and that looks most likely. In which case, I think what we would get would be a kind of a division in which the Russians keep Mariupol, they get Odessa, they cut Ukraine off from the sea, they get Crimea, which is signed away, and they also, in a sense, get the Luhansk and Donbass regions as part of Russia. So a shrunken and probably for a long time impoverished Ukraine is on the border, and that's but it's the result, however, of a peace process. I don't think that's a sustainable situation. I think it would be an extremely bad result. But for a while, it would seem to solve things. I think the reason it's not sustainable is that the Ukrainians would in fact begin to wage a war against in order to recover their losses. And of course, if there was an outright Russian victory in which the Russians actually conquered the country and set up a government, I think that would lead to a serious guerrilla warfare, which would last 10, 15 years, but which would end in defeat for the Russians. So the question is can we get a result at the conference table, which is not so bad for the Ukrainians? And my feeling is that that will only happen if the war carries on a little longer and has bad results for the Russians in the battle for Kiev. I mean, I think that unfortunately is probably true. And equally, it would be my first option, namely the Russians simply lose. But if the Russians win substantially, I don't think it's going to be the end, because there are 40 million Ukrainians, and now Ukrainian nationalism and patriotism have, in a sense, become a passion raging through the world, and it would not be the Spanish Civil War, because the Second World War prevented any kind of successful rebellion against Franco from outside. Now, I think you could say that there would be continued turbulence and fighting in Ukraine and around Ukraine, unless I don't see there being a stable Russian victory. I think they might win, but then they would suffer the consequences of winning as much as the Ukrainians would suffer the consequences of losing.
I would just add one other thing to that, if I may, which is that the thing that strikes me most is at the moment this question of how, given that it's likely that the Russians will certainly lose compared to the initial plan they had, one way or another, they don't achieve their Putin's primary initial military objective. How is it possible to persuade Putin to get off the ledge in a way that allows him to present to his people that he has somehow achieved the objectives he set out to achieve, and that the cost in both blood and treasure was worth it for the Russian people? That seems to me to be an incredibly difficult question. And in a way, unless one wants Vladimir Putin to be cornered, which my own sense is that for all sorts of geopolitical reasons, we don't want him to be, because a Putin cornered could be a very dangerous Putin. There has to be some agreement that allows him to walk away with a degree of face saving as well. I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, I do agree with it, but I think it's inconsistent with something else which you and I would both like to see, which is to say a peace treaty or a result of some kind that does not reduce Ukraine substantially and does not give Ukrainians good reason to carry on the battle after the battle has supposedly stopped. And I think that that's a really difficult problem. In a way, the best result, as I suggested, is the one that probably you think, and probably most people think, is the least likely, and that is an actual Russian defeat. An actual Russian defeat would mean that Putin would go. Now, when I say defeat, I'm not meaning it be inflicted by NATO and the West. That's one good reason why we're holding aloof from the battle. If he's going to lose or do very badly without actually losing, we don't want it to look as though we have managed that. This has been a NATO plot or anything like that. We want it to seem obviously flow from his failure of judgment and the failure of the military machine and the regime he's got to actually affect their will. I mean, that's really important. Once it looks as though they're no longer able to command success and to imprison and to repress effectively everywhere they need to, then the skids begin to be under them. And I think that's also true of their financial situation. So
Sure.
you've got a pincer movement here. You've got the Ukrainians and you've got the banks, and both of those are important in the battle against a Putin victory. But you're quite right. If he retains power and he retains enough authority within Russia, and at the same time is humiliated on the battlefield, that I think is and loses more or less everything. That is very dangerous too. There's no way out of this which isn't dangerous.
Yes. Now, let me bring you on to one other thing before I see we have a significant number of our friends sending in questions. So let me throw in what is, I know, an incredibly complex question as my final one. Now, let me put it this way. There is a division on the right internationally about this whole matter. I wrote about this recently in the Spectator, but it's a subject for a book length dissertation, really. Something has happened on the American right in particular, let's say, and I would propose that it comes about in part for the following reasons. Partly for a relatively short-term reason, partly for a longer-term one. The shorter-term reason is that Americans have heard far too much about Russia in the last 6 years. That for the 4 years of the Trump presidency, from the very moment he was elected, there were claims about collusion, about Russian interference, none of which were ever proven, all of which, once they were dismissed, still didn't die. But nevertheless, for the period of the Trump presidency, made the subject of Russia almost impossible to discuss domestically in the US, because this foreign policy issue had effectively become a litmus test domestic issue. Then you have the problem of Ukraine in the United States, which is that the most notorious thing that people in America know about Ukraine is the fact that the Biden family undoubtedly were among many families internationally in politics who enriched themselves in Ukraine. And that when this story, particularly to do with Burisma and Hunter Biden's involvement on a board in an area he knew nothing about, in a country he rarely visited, in a discipline he didn't have, that this effectively made Ukraine also a domestic political issue in the US, where it should have been a foreign policy discussion. Of course, then there was also the infamous Zelensky-Trump phone conversation. But that this made everything to do with Ukraine, like everything to do with Russia, almost impossible to discuss in any reasonable way in the United States of America, because of the toxicity to do with the Trump family on the one hand, the Biden family on the other. And then there's one other component of this I just wanted to throw out before asking your thoughts on this, which it seems to me that there has genuinely been a movement since the end of the Cold War. And I think it's probably of a generation, maybe slightly younger than mine, certainly a generation below yours, John, who thought that after the end of the Cold War, for instance, NATO had no point, that Russia was defeated, and then in the last 20 years, to some extent, fell for a form of Russian propaganda. And you and I have discussed this. You and I discussed this on the corners of the recent National Conservatism Conference in Florida. Those who thought, for instance, that we were, and again, there's a very plausible critique here, we were ridiculous and woke and obsessed with bathrooms and all of this sort of thing, and the Russians weren't. And a former part of the American right, as well as the European right, notoriously, fell for this idea that Vladimir Putin was what he presented himself as, the sort of counter-woke, the sort of ballast of sensible values, indeed of Christian values, and of much more. And that this has made a certain portion of the right in America not able to, as I said in my recent week, walk and chew Putin at the same time. That they haven't been able to recognize that our own societies have massive failings, but Russia does as well. And that you can in your head hold the thought that we do all sorts of ridiculous things, but in no way is the answer to that Putinism. So I just wanted to throw it out to you because this is clearly, and I'm sure we'll get to this in questions, this is clearly a very live and I think potentially dangerous corner that we're going through on the American right. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, on the 2 points very quickly, the first I'll deal with very quickly. I think that the obsession with the Trump-Russia connection was a fiction and a fake and an absurdity all the time. And everything else is really detail. And so the press and the Democratic Party not only started, but also kept alive and obsessed with, and made the American people obsess themselves with the idea that in some sense or other, President Trump was a Russian agent or a Russian agent of influence or whatever, or a dupe or whatever. Now, all of that seemed to me to completely be nonsense, as you could tell by the fact that actually his policies towards Russia were pretty tough. And they included, for example, arming Ukraine, which was never done by the Biden administration. They sent sandwiches and things. So I'm not concerned about, so I'll just simply say that I think that was always an absurdity. The story, the involvement of Biden in Ukraine never became the story it did because it was damaging to the Democratic candidate. And the media didn't want anything that was damaging to Biden to come to the fore. So that was, in a sense, you say we obsessed about it. Well, in a way, but it was below the radar of most people's attention, I think. Now, I think what you've just described about the turmoil or the problems, the divisions on the American right about how to respond to what's going on now is a very real and important question. And I think we have to really hammer this one out among ourselves in public, so to speak. First of all, it's an absurdity to think that Vladimir Putin is, so to speak, a conservative Christian leader who is anxious to run a campaign of, which he claimed in a recent speech about 3 months ago. He wanted to have an international situation in which everybody is, in a sense, engaged in continual conversation, discussion, agreement, alliance, but in a moderate way. I mean, look at what he's just done. Look at what he's continuing to do in terms of blowing the living daylights out of thousands of lives. I mean, and thousands of Russian lives as well. This is not the action of a disinterested, cool, calm, and calculating leader even of a Machiavellian kind or of a Metternichian kind. So that's absurd. What is he? Well, he's a former KGB agent. Who were his colleagues? This is a regime which is often said to be a combination of the oligarchs and the Silabiki, the KGB agents, the security, what they called in Northern Ireland, the securocrats, the people who ran the intelligence agencies. I don't believe the oligarchs have any real political influence. I'm sure they're helpful to the regime, and I'm sure that they finance some things that otherwise the regime would find it difficult to pay for. But they're agents rather than principals in this. So as a regime of KGB, as a KGB regime, what is it? It's a regime run on deception. It's continually presenting different faces to the world as necessary. I mean, Putin has tried to present himself as a conservative Christian leader as the representative of the Russian Orthodox tradition in history. And some people believe that he thinks that, and who knows what he privately thinks. I don't have a window into his soul. But when we see what he does, what is he doing now? Would any conservative Christian leader anxious to preserve civilization of Christendom, would he be inviting jihadists from Syria to join the battle?
Chechnya.
Chechnya, that's right. This is an absurdity, or asking the Chinese to give him some help as well. I mean, this is simply absurd. And now, what does it matter in a sense to the conservatives? I think this is the situation is, there is a perfectly reasonable argument we get from our colleagues, among other conservatives, that we were perhaps too willing to intervene in too many places with unclear motives and without the ability to sustain our interventions. And as a result, we've fought and lost too many wars. one of the principles of my foreign policy as a result of the last 20 or 30 years is I don't want to fight any more unsuccessful wars if I can avoid it. Now, so it shouldn't be a matter, it shouldn't be a policy. And if our friends are urging caution, prudence, selecting the battles we fight, attempting to find other ways of winning, maybe including sanctions in future, then I'm absolutely willing to listen to this and to give it credence. And I think we should do that. But it can't be a situation in which we try to pretend that attacks on America's interests aren't really attacks. They're simply hobgoblins in our own minds. Let me give you an example. This war, for example, it didn't begin with the invasion of Ukraine. It began with the letter demanding that NATO retreat from Central Europe and reverse the achievement of the West in the Cold War, achievement which at the time was welcomed by the Russians themselves, and not just at the time, but for about a decade and a half later. So we must realize that very often, we need to make sacrifices to defend real interests. And in today's world, in which China is a rising power, it would be a catastrophe for the United States if Europe were to become a place of the near abroad of Russia, rather than a reliable American ally, or even an unreliable American ally at times. So that's one thing. Now, the final point I'd make is this. I do notice something I find disturbing, which is this. I think most ordinary human beings look at what President Zelensky is doing, and they find it tremendously admirable. He looks like a political leader of great courage and extraordinary courage, really, and principle. Now, of course, he's a politician. He'll have his bad and weak side as well, but nonetheless, what he's doing is admirable. And I find a desire on the part of some of my conservative friends to drag him down because his popularity and the admiration people have for him is an obstacle to the kind of foreign policy they would prefer, one in which they abstain from intervention at all costs. And I think that's foolish, because among other things, ordinary people who are not particularly, political one way or another, they look at him and they see someone to admire. I think he's someone to admire, even if he's inconvenient to it. And as it happens, of course, I don't think he is inconvenient to us. I think he's far more inconvenient to President Putin.
We must hand over to participants. And I wonder if, Peter, you would select some questions that have come up in the chat.
Thank you. This is a question related to what you were just talking about, John. And it's a way to, they're asking how to think about not necessarily the Ukrainian leaders, but other Eastern European leaders, particularly Polish leaders, who seem to be have authoritarian tendencies. And there is this sort of push on the right to lionize certain leaders who are nationalist figures, who are sort of helping with the relief. And how can we think about some of this nationalism, which may be positive, without adopting some of the authoritarian tendencies of the leaders? Or maybe, is there a nuanced view? How can we think about these leaders that's more nuanced?
Well, I don't think that the Poles have attracted as much of the kind of criticism as you're describing as the Prime Minister in Hungary, Viktor Orban, has. And in the case of Poland, very briefly, the view is that the Catholic Church has, in a sense, or rather the Law and Justice Party is too conservative and too Catholic in a social sense. Well, you can argue that, but they won elections. The bill on abortion, which is regarded as the strongest expression of the Catholicism to which the opposition objects in Poland. And that bill was talked about in the election. And when they won, they passed. They went through all the normal democratic tests, and it's got through. Now, I don't myself. I think that I'm strongly pro-life. That particular measure wouldn't have been the way I would have begun things, but nonetheless, I'm not Polish, and it seems to me that the case against the law and justice government is extremely weak in terms of authoritarianism and so on. It's just that people don't like its policies, and they don't like the fact that it's, particularly in Brussels, they don't like the fact that it wants to follow its own rules and not pay so much attention to what Brussels wants it to do. Now, let's get on to Orban, which is a similar case. Orban is said to be, I keep reading things like this, a dictator. Well, practically, or it's said that, for example, there's no freedom of the press in Hungary, or that the government is authoritarian. Well, you know, when you ask for evidence of this, you get very, very weak replies. Most people in Hungary, I would say, including those who don't like the Viktor Orban at all, or very strongly opposed to him, most of them do not believe this is an authoritarian government. It hasn't acted in an authoritarian way. For example, it hasn't challenged it's always accepted the rules of the Constitutional Court. It has a 2/3 majority, which means that it has a greater authority than most governments would in terms of the rule of law, but it hasn't, in my view, abused those powers, and they've been exercised in. Well, a very good example would be the accusations made against the Hungarian government when it introduced its emergency legislation to deal with the pandemic. Those rules were said to be evidence that the government was about to clamp down, send people to prison, arrest them to think. Well, it turned out that they were more or less exactly the same rules as were brought in France, Germany, Britain, and elsewhere in Europe, and that they were abandoned more quickly because the government, in a sense, has always responded very to criticism. It's always responded cautiously, and it's been prepared, for example, to abandon some legislation if there's been a popular movement against it. And they've several times used referendums, popular votes, to, in a sense, allow themselves to retreat from positions they thought were unpopular. So I find it very hard to make sense of these accusations. I mean, let's say I see what they are, and we're about to have a test. I mean, there have been elections since Viktor Orban won in 2010. He's won again with a substantial majority in 2014 and again in 2018. And on April the 3rd, there's about to be another election. And I'm not including here local elections and European elections. They've had lots of them as well. It's generally speaking, except in one local elections, he's won substantial majorities. The opposition has time and now thinks it has a chance of beating him. I mean, it does have a chance of beating him, but the fact is, if they think and they admit they have a chance of beating him, how is this an authoritarian dictatorship? I mean, it isn't is the answer to that question. And I personally think he'll win because I think people want to keep a hold of nerves for fear of finding something worse when you have a war going on next door. And there's a feeling that he's a man who knows how to handle difficult situations. And he's been, in a sense, he's based his arguments about what's happening in Ukraine very firmly on the conservative ground of prudence. He doesn't want to take actions which will involve Hungary in the war. At the same time, he's a loyal member of NATO and has gone along with all of its collective decisions. So that seems to me essentially a prudent position that he's taken, and it's one that the opposition has found it hard to combat. So my feeling would be he's undoubtedly authoritative. He is a man who acts with authority. He has both natural authority and he has the legitimate authority of a democratically elected government. And he doesn't feel that he should necessarily abandon his views or the policies simply because a group of bureaucrats in Brussels tell him that it's against the decisions of the European Parliament, which is not supposed to have much power, or anything else. I mean, so my view would be, you can attack Orban, you can point out the things wrong with him, but the idea that he's a dictator is an absurdity.
Peter, we've probably got time for two very quick questions before we finish. Let's try to squeeze two more in.
Okay, sounds good. Well, quickly, here's a question from one of our listeners. What do you think China, what are the maybe 2 or 3 biggest things that China may be learning from this whole experience that we're seeing unfold?
Well, if you're asking me, I'd say be very cautious of allying yourself with the man who is probably going to go on a bender, which you don't necessarily want to accompany on him past the first couple of pubs. I mean, Putin, we have thought of as a cold, calculating Machiavellian, but he's a passionate believer in the revival of the Russian Empire. And he's been drinking a lot of vodka, and he's decided he's going to bring it about. I think in Beijing, they must look upon their decision to actually offer him support as a mistake. And I think at the moment that they will continue to give token support, but they are rapidly calculating. And unfortunately for Putin, the calculation is the following one. Should we stick with Putin because he's in such a weak position in relation to us that he's going to be the junior partner in a joint Sino-Russian enterprise? Or should we get rid of him because any close connection with him is going to be a terrible embarrassment with the rest of the world? Now, I'd like them having that kind of a dilemma, but I'm sure Putin, once he realizes that is their dilemma, will find it very alarming.
I would just add one thing to that, which is John O'Sullivan mentioned our mutual friend Andrew Roberts earlier, and Andrew Roberts' terrific history of World War II comes to the conclusion, as many other historians have as well, the Nazis lost World War II because they were Nazis, because their priorities were Nazism, not winning the war. And even right up to the end, they ended up doing things which made no sense if you were winning a war, but made a lot of sense if you were a Nazi. In the same way, Vladimir Putin is going to lose this because he is a believer in the Soviet Union and the possibility of putting that back together. And it turns out that everyone else has moved on and he hasn't. And this will be his downfall. But by the way, I would just add one thing on the China issue. I think that, again, something we thought a few weeks ago, which was Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine, China then has the green light to invade Taiwan. I'd be extremely surprised if China, seeing the extraordinary swiftness and unanimity with which the rest of the world has been able to respond to Russian aggression in Ukraine, if China thought that they were going to be able to withstand some kind of similar international sanction, were they to think of carrying out an act of aggression against Taiwan. So actually, as it currently stands, I think the possibility of Chinese expansionism is probably also less than it has been in some years.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah. Do you think Xi's days are numbered? Because it seems to me that he's not been as extreme in going off in ideological benders as Putin, but he has given away a tremendous strong position rooted in the fact that we didn't think the Chinese were a threat. No.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Have we got time for one more, Peter?
Yeah, sure. I guess the last question is, and you may have sort of answered it with this last your description of his ideological commitments, but to what effect will these sanctions have, and will the sanctions last on Russia? Will these last, and will they make a difference in the end? Quickly, what do you guys think?
Douglas,
my view is they're already making a significant difference. even the oligarchs, not that they're exactly representative of the average Russian, but the oligarchs are half as rich this week than they were last week. The ruble has crashed. The fact that people can't get hold, those people who had bank accounts abroad can't actually access their bank accounts. This was a sort of worst case scenario for many of them. And like John, I feel a certain unease about some of the claims of seizure of property of people in common law countries like Britain, where precisely the fact that we are common law countries and so on is the reason why people wanted to stash wealth in these countries, and that there was the rule of law and much more. But for average Russians, there is, of course, that if one can say there's such a thing, there is the obvious fact that significant deprivation is going to continue to be coming their way. I would just add a necessary caveat to that, which is that if any peoples on the face of the earth are capable of living through deprivation, God knows it's the Russians. So the idea that inevitably, once they suffer economically, and there is no evidence that there's supply chain problems, particularly in Russia at the moment, and they can do a lot of their business through China. I don't think China's going to sell anything to them on the cheap, as it were. But at the moment, there's no particular supply issue in Russia. There's obviously inflation and much more, and crash of currency issue. However, we should be careful in anticipating what that means, and particularly careful in thinking that it's inevitably going to go our way, because it is perfectly possible that the Russian people, as deprivation of one kind or another increases, blame the rest of the world for that, and not the person who actually they should blame, which is the man who's spent the last 2 years mulling in the Kremlin on his own and clearly getting more and more enraged. So it's perfectly possible the Russians blame the rest of the world.
Just to add to that, I mean, I agree with everything that Douglas just said, but there's another sanction which has become weakened by the Biden administration recently, and that is the sanction of deterrence. Until recently, we used to say that you couldn't attack a country if it had nuclear weapons. But now we're saying you can't resist a country if it has nuclear weapons. And that's a very big weakening. And I think that at some point, not in the context of the war now, there's going to have to be a rethinking and restatement of deterrence policy by the President of the United States. And in the meantime, we have to follow the conclusion, which is clear, that if you can't rely as much on nuclear weapons as you used to be able to as a deterrent, you have to build up your conventional forces in a very big way. And that applies particularly if you're in a weak position, like, for example, the Baltic states. And we would have to be part of that, building up their defenses, so that we wouldn't have to think of, we wouldn't be able to use, if we can't use our nuclear deterrent as a threat against their invasion, the invasion of the states by Russia, then we have to be prepared to actually win a conventional war on the ground there. And I don't think that's something which we'd really considered deeply until recently. But if NATO promises are going to mean anything, we're going to have to think of that.
Well, thank you, John and Douglas, for your time today. This was a very enlightening hour. I very much enjoyed it, and I'm sure our listeners did too. If you enjoyed it listening, please join us when we come on our roadshow. Our regional seminars are coming to a city near you, and you can check those out on our website, nrinstitute.org. Again, Douglas and John, thank you for your time. This was wonderful.
Thank you very much indeed.
You.
I very much enjoyed it.
Great pleasure as always.
Yes. All the best, Douglas. See you soon, I hope.
Absolutely.
Bye. Cheers.